Chapter 4 Change and Development in Rural Society. Indian society is primarily a rural society through urbanization is growing. The majority of India's people live in rural areas, 67%. They make their living from agriculture or related occupations. This means that agricultural land is the most important productive resource for a great many Indians. Land is also the most important form of property, but land is not just a means of production, nor just a form of property, nor is agriculture just a form of livelihood. It is also a way of life. Many of our cultural practices and patterns can be traced to our agrarian backgrounds. You will recall from the earlier chapters how closely interrelated structural and cultural changes are. For example, most of the New Year festivals in different regions of India, such as Pongal in Tamil Nadu, Bihu in Assam, Baisakhi in Punjab, and Ugadi in Karnataka, to name just few, actually celebrate the main harvest season and herald the beginning of new agricultural season. Find out other harvest festivals. There is a close connection between agricultural and culture. The nature and practice of agriculture varies greatly across different regions of the country. These variations are reflected in different regional structures. One can say that the both culture and social structure in rural India are closely bound up with agricultural and agrarian way of life. Agriculture is the single most important source of livelihood for the majority of rural population. But the rural is not just agriculture. Many activities that support agriculture and village life are also sources of livelihood for people in rural India. For example, a large number of artisans such as potters, carpenters, weavers, ironsmiths, and goldsmiths are found in rural areas. They were once part and parcel of the village economy. Their numbers have been steadily lessening since the colonial period. You have already read in chapter 1 how the influx of manufactured goods and replaced handmade products. Rural life supported many other specialists and craftspersons as storytellers, astrologers, priests, water distributors, and oil pressers. The diversity of occupation in rural India was reflected in the caste system, which is the most regions included specialist and service caste such as washermen, potters, and goldsmiths. Some of these traditional occupations have declined, but increasing interconnection of the rural and urban economies have led to many diverse occupations. Many people living in rural areas are employed in or have livelihoods based in rural non-farm activities. For instance, there are rural residents employed in government services such as postal and education departments, factory workers, or in the army who earn their living through non agricultural activities. Agrarian structure, caste, and class in rural India. Agricultural land is the single most important resource and form of property in rural society, but it is not equally distributed among people living in particular village or region. Nor does everyone have access to land. In fact, the distribution of land holdings in most regions is highly unequal among households. In some parts of India, the majority of rural households own at least some land, usually very small plots. In other areas, as much as 40 to 50% of families do not own any land at all. This means that they are dependent on agricultural labor or other kinds of work for their livelihoods. This, of course, means that a few families are well to do, the majority lives just above or below the poverty line. In most regions of India, women usually excluded from ownership of land because of the prevailing patrilineal kinship system and mode of inheritance. By law, women are supposed to have an equal share of family property. In reality, they have only limited rights and some access to land, only as part of household headed by a man. The term agrarian structure is often used to refer to the structure or distribution of land holding. Because agricultural land is the most important productive resource in rural areas, access to land shapes the rural area structure. Access to land largely determines what role one plays in the process of agricultural production. Medium and large landowners are usually able to earn sufficient or even large incomes from cultivation. But agricultural laborers are more often than not paid below the statutory minimum wage and earn very little. Their incomes are low. Their employment is insecure. Most agricultural laborers are daily wage workers and do not have work for many days of the year. This is known as underemployment. Similarly, tenants have lower incomes than owner cultivators because they have to pay a substantial rent to the landowner, often as much as 50 to 75% of the income from the crop. Agrarian society, therefore, can be understood in terms of its class structure, but we must also remember structure that is through the caste system. In rural areas, there is a complex relationship between caste and class. This relationship is not always straightforward. We might expect that the higher caste have more land and higher incomes, and that there is a correspondence between caste and class as one moves down the hierarchy. In many areas, this is broadly true, but not exactly. For instance, in most areas in higher caste, the Brahmins are not major landowners, and so they fall outside the agrarian structure although they are part of rural society. In most regions of India, the major landowning groups belonging to the upper caste. In each region, there are usually one or two major landowning castes who are also numerically very important. Such groups were termed as dominant caste by the sociologist M. N. Srinivas. In each region, the dominant caste is the most powerful group, economically and politically, and dominates local society. Examples of dominant land owning groups are Jats and Rajputs of UP, Vokaligas and Lingyats of Karnataka, Kammas and Reddys in Andhra Pradesh, and Jat Sikhs in Punjab. While dominant land owning groups are usually middle or high rank castes, most of the marginal farmers and landlords belong to lower caste groups. In official classification, they belong to the scheduled caste or tribes or other backward classes. In many regions of India, the former untouchable or Dalit caste were not allowed to own land and they provided the most of the agricultural labor for the dominant landowning groups. This also created a labor force that allowed the landowners to cultivate the land intensively and get higher returns. The rough correspondence between caste and class means that typically the upper and middle caste also had the best access to land and resources and hence to power and privilege. This had important implications for the rural economy and society. In most regions of the country, a proprietary caste group owns most of the resources and can command labor to work for them. Until recently, practices such as beggar or free labor were prevalent in many parts of northern India. Members of low ranked caste groups had to provide labor for a fixed number of days per year to the village zamindar or landlord. Similarly, lack of resources and dependence on the landed class for economic, social, and political support meant that many of the working poor were tied to landowners in hereditary labor relationships such as Halpati system in Gujarat and Jita system in Karnataka. Although such practices have been abolished legally, they continue to exist in many areas. In a village of northern Bihar, the majority of landowners are Bhumihars, who are also the dominant caste. The impact of land reforms. The colonial period. There are historical reasons why each region of India became to be dominated by just one or two major groups, but it is important to realize that this agrarian structure has changed enormously over time. From pre-colonial to the colonial after independence, while same dominant castes were probably also cultivating castes in the pre-colonial period. They were not the direct owners of land, instead ruling groups such as the local kings or the zamindars, who were politically powerful in their areas and usually belonged to Kshatriya or higher caste, controlled the land. The peasants or cultivators who worked on the land to hand over a substantial portion of the produce to them. When the British colonized India, in many areas they ruled through the local zamindars. They also granted property rights to the zamindars. Under the British, zamindars were given more control over land than they had before. Since the colonizers also imposed heavy land revenue taxes on agriculture, the zamindars extracted as much produce as money as they could out of the cultivators. One result of the Zamindari system was that agricultural production stagnated or declined during much of the British rule. For peasants fled from oppressive landlords and frequent famines and wars decimated the population. Many districts of colonial India were administered through the Zamindari system. In other areas, they were under direct British rule, had what was called the Redwater System of land settlement. In this system, the actual cultivators, rather than the zamindars, were responsible for paying the tax. Because colonial government dealt directly with the farmers or landlords, rather than through the overlords, the burden of taxation was less and cultivators had more incentive to invest in agriculture. As a result, these areas become relatively more productive and prosperous. This background about land revenue administration in colonial India, much of which you have learned in your history books, is important to keep in mind when studying the agrarian structure of present day India. This is because it is through a series of changes, starting from the period that the current structure evolved. Independent India. After India became independent, Nehru and his policy advisors embarked on a program of planned development that focused on agrarian reform as well as program of planned development as well as industrialization. The policymakers were responsible for the dismal agriculture situation at that time. This was marked by low productivity, dependence on imported food grains, and the intense poverty of a large section of rural population. They felt that a major reform in the agrarian structure, and especially in the land holding system and distribution of land, was necessary if agriculture were to progress. From 1950s to 70s, a series of land reform laws were passed at the national level as well as the states. They were intended to bring about these changes. The first important legislation was the abolition of Zamindari system, which removed the layer of intermediaries who stood between the cultivators and the state. Of all the land reform laws that were passed, this was probably the most effective, for in most areas it succeeded in taking away the superior rights of the Vidars over the land and weakening their economic and political power. This did not happen without a struggle, of course, but ultimately the effect was to strengthen the position of actual landholders and cultivators at the local level. However, Zamindari abolition did not wipe out landlordism or tenancy or sharecropping system which continued in many areas. It only removed the top layer of landlords in the multi-layered agrarian structure. Among the major land reform laws that were introduced were the Tenancy Abolition and the Regulation Acts. They attempted either to outlaw tenancy together or regulate rents to give some security to the tenants. In most of the states, these laws were never implemented very effectively. In West Bengal and Kerala, there was a radical restructuring of the agrarian structure that gave land rights to the tenants. The third major category of land reform laws were the Land Sealing Acts. These laws imposed an upper limit on the amount of land that can be owned by a particular family. The ceiling varies from region to region, depending on kind of land, its productivity and other such factors. Very productive land has a low ceiling, while unproductive dry land has a higher ceiling limit. According to these acts, the state is supposed to identify and take possession of surplus land held by each household and redistribute it to landless families and households in other specified categories. But in most of the states, these acts proved to be toothless. There were many loopholes and other strategies through which most landowners were able to escape from having their surplus land taken over by the state. While some very large states were broken up, in most cases landowners managed to divide the land among relatives and others, including servants, in so called Benami transfers, which allowed them to keep control over the land. In some places, some rich farmers actually divorced their wives in order to avoid the provision of Land Sealing Act, which allowed a separate share for unmarried women but not for wives. The agrarian structure varies across India, and the progress of land reforms has also been uneven across states. On the whole, however, it can be said that agrarian structure, although it has changed substantially from colonial time to present, remain highly unequal. This structure puts constraint on agricultural productivity. Land reforms are necessary not only to boost agricultural growth but also to eradicate poverty in rural areas and bring about social justice. The Green Revolution and its social consequences. We saw that land reforms have had only a limited impact on rural society and the agrarian structure in most regions. In contrast, the Green Revolution of 1960s and 70s brought about significant changes in the areas where it took place. The Green Revolution, as you know, was a government program of agricultural modernization. It was largely funded by international agencies with the based on providing high yielding variety or hybrid seeds along with pesticides, fertilizers, and other inputs to farmers. Green Revolution programs were introduced only in areas that had assured irrigation because sufficient water was necessary for new seeds and method of cultivation. It was also targeted mainly at the wheat and rice growing areas. As a result, only certain regions such as Punjab, Western UP, coastal Andhra Pradesh, and parts of Tamil Nadu received the first wave of Green Revolution package. The rapid social and economic transformation that was seen in these areas stimulated a spate of studies by social scientists and vigorous debate about the impact of Green Revolution. Agricultural productivity increased sharply because of the new technology. India was able to become self sufficient in food grain production for the first time in decades. The Green Revolution has been considered a major achievement of the government and of the scientists who contributed to the effort. However, there were certain negative social effects that were pointed out by sociologists who studied the Green Revolution areas as well as adverse environmental impacts. In most of the Green Revolution areas, it was primarily the medium and large farmers who were able to benefit from the new technology. This was because inputs were expensive and small, and marginal farmers could not afford to spend as much as large farmers to purchase these inputs. When agriculturists produced primarily for themselves and unable to produce the market, it is known as subsistence agriculture, and they are usually termed peasants. Agriculturists or farmers are those who are able to produce surplus over above the needs of the family and so are linked to the market. It was the farmers who were able to produce a surplus for the market who were able to reap most benefits from the Green Revolution and from commercialization of agriculture that followed. Then in the first phase of Green Revolution in the 1960s and 70s, the introduction of new technology seemed to be increasing inequalities in rural society. Green Revolution crops were highly profitable mainly because they yielded more produce. Well to do farmers who had access to land, capital, technology, and know how, and those who could invest in the new seeds and fertilizers could increase their production and earn more money. However, in many cases, it led to the displacement of tenant cultivators, for landowners began to take back land from their tenants and cultivate it directly because cultivation was becoming more profitable. This made the rich farmers better off and worsened the condition of the landless and marginal holders. In addition, introduction of machinery such as tillers, tractors, threshers, and harvesters led to displacement of service caste groups who used to carry out these agricultural related activities. This process of displacement also increased the pace of rural urban migration. The ultimate outcome of green revolution was a process of differentiation in which rich grew richer and many of the poor stagnated or grew poorer. It should be noted that employment and wages for agricultural workers did increase in many areas because the demand for labor increased. Moreover, rising prices and a shift in the mode of payment of agricultural workers from payment in kind grain to cash actually worsened the economic condition of most rural workers. Following the first phase of green revolution, the second phase of currently being introduced in dry and semi-arid regions of India. In these areas, there has been significant shift from dry to wet cultivation, along with changes in cropping pattern and types of crops grown. Increasing commercialization and dependence on market in these areas has increased rather than reduced livelihood insecurity, as farmers who once grew food for consumption now depend on the market for their incomes. In market oriented cultivation, especially where a single crop is grown, a fall in prices or a bad crop can spell financial ruin for a farmer. In most of the green revolution areas, farmers have switched from a multi-crop system which allowed them to spread risk to a monocrop regime, which means that there is nothing fall back on in case of cross crop failure. Another negative outcome of green revolution was the worsening of regional inequalities. The areas that underwent this technological transformation became more developed, while other areas stagnated. For instance, the green revolution was promoted more in western and southern parts of the country, and in Punjab, Haryana, and western UP than in the eastern parts of the country. As a result, we find agriculture in states such as Bihar and in eastern UP and in dry regions such as Telangana to be relatively undeveloped. These are also the regions that continue to have the entrenched feudal agrarian structure in which landed caste and landlords maintain power over lower caste. Landless workers and small cultivators, the sharp caste and class inequalities, together with exploitative labor relations in these regions, have given rise to various kinds of violence in recent years. Often it thought that imparting knowledge of scientific farming methods will improve conditions of Indian farmers. We should remember that Indian farmers have been cultivating the land for centuries, much before the advent of green revolution. They have very deep and extensive traditional knowledge about the land they till and the crops they sow. Much of this knowledge, like the many traditional varieties of seeds that were developed over the centuries by farmers, is being lost as hybrid, high yielding, and genetically modified varieties of seeds are being promoted as more productive and scientific. In view of the negative environmental social impact of modern methods of cultivation that have been observed, a number of scientists as well as farmers movements now suggest to return to traditional, more organic seeds and methods of cultivation. Many rural people themselves believe that hybrid varieties are less healthy than the traditional ones. Transformation in rural society after independence. Several profound transformations in nature of social relations in rural area took place in the post-independence period, especially in those regions that underwent green revolution. These included an increase in use of agricultural labor as cultivation became more intensive, a shift from payment in kind to payment in cash, a loosening of traditional bonds or hereditary relationships between farmers or landowners and agricultural workers, and the rise of class of free wage laborers. The change in nature of relationship between landlords and agricultural workers was described by sociologist Jan Breman as a shift from patronage to exploitation. Such changes took place in many areas where agriculture was becoming more commercialized, that is, where crops were being grown primarily for the sale in the market. The transformation in labor relations is regarded by some scholars as indicative of a transition to capitalist agriculture. Because the capitalist mode of production is based on separation of the workers from means of production, the use of free wage labor. In general, it is true that farmers in this more developed region were becoming more oriented to the market. As cultivation became more commercialized, these rural areas were also becoming integrated to the wider economy. This process increased the flow of money into villages and expanding opportunities for business and employment. Thus, we should remember that this process of transformation in rural economy in fact began during the colonial period. In many regions, in 19th century, large tracts of land in Maharashtra were given over to cotton cultivation and cotton farmers became directly linked to the world market. However, pace and spread of change rapidly increased after independence. However, as the government promoted modern methods of cultivation and attempted to modernize the rural economy through other strategies, the state invested in the development of rural infrastructure such as irrigation facilities, roads, and electricity, and on the provision of agricultural inputs, including credit through banks and cooperatives for regular agricultural growth and interrupted banks and power bank supply to rural India is one of the necessities. The recently launched Deen Dayal Upadhyay Gram Jyoti Yojana is an effort of the Indian government in this direction. The overall outcome of these efforts at rural development was not only to transform rural economy and agriculture but also the agrarian structure of the rural society itself. One way which rural structure was altered by agricultural development in 1960s and 70s was through the enrichment of medium and large farmers who adopted new technologies discussed in previous section. In several agriculturally rich regions such as Andhra Pradesh, Western Uttar Pradesh, Central Gujarat, well-to-do farmers belonging to dominant caste began to invest their profits from agriculture in other types of business ventures. This process of diversification gave rise to new entrepreneurial groups that moved out of rural areas and into growing towns of these developing regions, giving rise to new regional elites that became economically as well as politically dominant. Along with this change in the class structure, the spread of higher education, especially private professional colleges in rural and semi urban areas, allowed the new rural elites to educate their children, many of whom then joined professional or white collar occupations or started businesses, feeding into expansion of urban middle classes. Thus, in areas of rapid agricultural development, there has been a consolidation of the old landed or cultivating groups who have transformed themselves into a dynamic entrepreneurial rural urban dominant class. Thus, in other regions such as eastern UP and Bihar, the lack of effective land reforms, political mobilization, and redistributive measures has meant that there have been relatively few changes in the agrarian structure and hence in the condition of most people. In contrast, states such as Kerala have undergone a different process of development in which political mobilization, redistributive measures, and linkages to an external economy have brought about a substantial transformation of rural countryside. Far from rural being primarily agrarian, the rural in Kerala is a mixed economy that integrates some agriculture with a wide network of retail sales and service, and where a large number of families are dependent on remittances from abroad. Circulation of labor. Another significant change in rural society that it is linked to commercialization of agriculture has been the growth of migrant agricultural labor. As traditional bonds of patronage between laborers or tenants and landlords broke down, and as the seasonal demand for agricultural labor increased in prosperous green revolution regions such as Punjab, a pattern of seasonal migration emerged in which thousands of workers circulate between their home villages and more prosperous areas where there is more demand for labor and higher wages. Laborers migrate also due to increasing inequalities in rural areas from mid 1990s, which have forced many households to combine multiple occupations to sustain themselves. As a livelihood strategy, men migrate out periodically in search of work and better wages, while women and children are often left behind in villages with elderly grandparents. Migrant workers come mainly from drought prone and less productive regions, and they go to part of the year on farms in Punjab and Haryana, or on brick kilns in UP, or construction sites in cities such as New Delhi or Bangalore. These migrant workers have been termed footloose labor by Jan Bremen. But this does not imply freedom. Bremen's study shows to the contrary that landless workers do not have many rights. For instance, they are usually not paid the minimum wage. It should be noted that wealthy farmers often prefer employ migrant workers for harvesting and other such intensive operations rather than local working class because migrants are more easily exploited and can be paid lower wages. This preference has produced a peculiar pattern in some areas where local landless laborers moved out of home villages in search of work during peak agricultural seasons, while migrant workers are brought in from other areas to work on local farms. This pattern is found especially in sugarcane growing areas. Migration and lack of job security have created very poor working and living conditions for these workers. The large scale circulation of labor has had several significant effects on rural society in both receiving and supplying regions. For instance, in the poor areas where male family members spend much of the year working outside their villages, cultivation has become primarily a female task. Women are also emerging as the main source of agricultural labor, leading to feminization of agricultural labor force. The insecurity of women is greater than because they earn lower wages than men for similar work. Until recently, women were hardly visible in official statistics as earners and workers, while women toil on the land as landed laborers and as cultivators. The prevailing patrilineal kinship system and other cultural practices that privilege male rights largely exclude women from land ownership. Globalization, liberalization, and rural society. The policy of liberalization that India has been following since the late 1980s have had a very significant impact on agriculture and rural society. The policy entails participation in the World Trade Organization, which aims to bring about a more free international trading system and requires opening up of Indian markets to imports. After decades of state import and protected markets, Indian farmers support have been exposed to competition from global market. For instance, we have all seen imported fruits and other food items on the shelves of our local stores, items that were not available a few years ago because of import barriers. Recently, India has also decided to import wheat, a controversial decision that reverses the earlier policy of self-reliance in food grains and brings back bitter memories of dependency on American food grains in the early years of after independence. These are indicators of the process of globalization of agriculture or the incorporation of agriculture into a larger global market, a process that has had direct effects on farmers and rural society. For instance, in some regions such as Punjab and Karnataka, farmers enter into contracts with multinational companies to grow certain crops, which the company buy from them for processing or export. In such contract farming systems, the company identifies the crop to be grown, provides the seeds and other inputs, as well as know how and often also the working capital. In return, the farmer is assured of the market because company guarantees that it will purchase the produce at a predetermined fixed price. Contract farming is very common now in the production of specialized items such as cut flowers, fruits, grapes, figs, pomegranates, cotton and oilseeds. While contract farming appears to provide financial security to farmers, it can also lead to greater insecurity as farmers become dependent on these companies for their livelihoods. Contract farming of exported oriented products such as flowers and gherkins also mean that agricultural land is diverted away from fruit grain production. Contract farming has sociological significance in that it engages many people from the production process and makes their own indigenous knowledge of agriculture irrelevant. In addition, contract farming caters primarily to the production of elite items and not because it requires high doses of fertilizers and pesticides. It is often not ecologically sustainable. Another more widespread aspect of globalization of agriculture is the entry of multinationals into sector as sellers of agricultural inputs such as seeds, pesticides, and fertilizers. Over the last decade or so, the government has scaled down its agricultural development programs, and agricultural extension agents have been replaced in the villages by agents of seeds, fertilizer, and pesticide companies. These agents are often the sole source of information for farmers about new seeds or cultivation practices, and of course, they have an interest in selling their products. This has led to increased dependence of farmers on expensive fertilizers and pesticides, which has reduced their profits and put farmers into debt and also created an ecological crisis in rural areas. While farmers in India for centuries have periodically faced distress due to drought, crop failures, or debt, the phenomenon of farmer suicide appears to be new. Sociologists have attempted to explain this phenomenon by looking at structural and social changes that have been occurring in agriculture and agrarian society. Such suicides have become matrix events, that is, a range of factors coalesce to form an event. Many farmers who have committed suicide were marginal farmers who were attempting to increase their productivity primarily by practicing green evolution methods. However, undertaking such production meant facing several risks. Cost of production has increased tremendously due to decrease in agricultural subsidies. The markets are not stable and many farmers borrow heavily in order to invest in expensive inputs and improve their production. The loss of either the crop and in some cases lack of an adequate support or market price means that farmers are unable to bear the debt burden. Support or market price means that farmers are unable to bear the debt burden or sustain their families. Such distress is compounded by changing culture in rural areas in which increased incomes are required for marriages, dowries, and sustain new activities and expenses such as education and medical care. The pattern of farmer suicide point to the significant crisis that rural areas are experiencing. Agriculture for many is becoming untenable and state support for agriculture has declined substantially. In addition, agriculture issues has no longer key public issues and lack of mobilization means that agriculturists are unable to form powerful pressure groups that can influence policy making in their favor. Suicides of farmers is basically associated with debt as well as natural disasters, resulting in a failure of agricultural produce. Pradhan Mantri Faisal Bima Yojana, Gram Uday Se Bharat Uday Abhiyan, and National Urban Mission are some of the schemes of Government of India, which may provide unified help to farmers all over the country. These schemes are also helpful in providing quality life to rural India.